y'all. So I'm Julie Clip-Nicholson, and I am the coordinator of the Buncombe County Family Justice Center. And I want to talk a little bit about how victims of domestic and sexual violence, and really victims of any crime in our community, can access our court system as a way to seek protection and legal remedies. And then I'll also talk about the resources that are available at the Family Justice Center for somebody who has experienced the crime of domestic or sexual violence. When we, and I'll say I'm an attorney. I am no longer practicing because I'm scheduling a lot of meetings for a lot of folks in a multidisciplinary team. But I worked at Pisgah Legal Services for several years, representing victims of domestic and sexual violence in accessing justice through the court system. And it can be a really empowering and feel like a path to safety for survivors. It can also be overwhelming and intimidating. And as Judge Dotson-Smith said, without a lawyer there to help navigate that system, very often survivors were not able to get the protections that they were entitled to. So when we think about accessing justice, when we think about that I have been harmed and I'm going to go to the court system to access legal remedies, I'll go in front of a judge. I didn't set my timer. Let me do that real quick. I didn't hit start. That's a very important thing to do. So I've been harmed. I want to go to the justice system and access justice. We think about two doors into the justice system, and really those doors don't often lead to this bright sunshiny day. They lead to what can be more of a black box for folks in our community because we don't always know how those decisions are made. The first door that I'm going to talk about is civil remedies. There's the civil process and then the criminal process. So civil legal protections are where an individual citizen or resident can come in and file what we call a complaint, because we're complaining to the court about what was done to us. We are responsible for filing that paperwork, as Judge Dotson-Smith said, making sure that the elements, the required elements and the required information is on the paperwork. The victim of crime can represent themselves or hire an attorney, or if they are eligible, Pisgah Legal Services may be able to represent them in that process. In civil legal matters, there's no automatic right to an attorney for either the victim or the defendant. It is a process by which people have to navigate the legal rules and maze by themselves unless they're able to afford an attorney. We're also talking about, so we're talking about safety things around domestic violence, but we're also talking about issues like custody of your children, or whether or not an eviction filed against you is an appropriate eviction. So there's a lot of really basic rights that are impacted by the civil legal process where you don't have a right to an attorney. The great thing about the civil legal process is that as the plaintiff in that process, as the person filing that paperwork, I have a broader range of remedies. And judges have more opportunity to sort of be creative and make the decision fit the case. So for victims of domestic violence, we primarily think about the civil legal protection as what we call a domestic violence protective order, also known as a 50B or a B52 sometimes. 50B is the North Carolina general statute that created the protective order. In order to get this order, there has to be a personal relationship between the plaintiff, the person who was harmed, and the defendant. And in North Carolina, that personal relationship can be marriage, living together, or people of opposite sex who are in a dating relationship. And that element is very clear. It is purposefully not protective of people who are in same-sex dating relationships who have not lived together. So, opportunity for advocacy. In order to get a domestic violence protective order, you have to show to the court that the defendant has committed an act of domestic violence, and there's some legal definitions around that. So to get a domestic violence protective order, I would go in front of Judge Dotson Smith, or one of our district court judges, and I would explain what my person with whom I have a personal relationship has done to me, how they've harmed me, and explain that and can explain that I need an emergency protective order. So it can be me without the other person. That's called an ex parte, without the other party. That order can be in place for up to 10 days. And that's really essential for victims of domestic violence because that's the most dangerous time. When a victim chooses to leave a relationship, 75% of domestic violence homicides occur during that time. So judges have the opportunity to enter an order, an emergency order, to help prevent it, and he's no longer able to do that.
How is he?
Huh?
How is he prevented?
I can call law enforcement
Okay.
and say, I've got a domestic violence protective order, he's outside of my house, and that's going to be a very different response than just he's driving down the street outside of my house. Yeah. A domestic violence protective order can do a broad range of remedies as well, including decide who has the house. It can enter an order around temporary custody of the children, which is very often used as a power and control over a victim of domestic violence. I'll take the kids, you'll never see them. And so having an order that clarifies custody, temporary custody of the children is really important. You can give the victim or the abuser the possession of the car. Very important for families that only have one mode of transportation. And it can order the abuser to stay away from certain places, workplaces, schools, churches, those sorts of things. And this is essential for the victim and for the safety of our community. We know that 54% of the mass shootings that have happened in the last decade have been directly related to domestic violence. And so when we have an order that protects the places where a victim might go, it protects those other people as well. You can also order an abuser not to possess firearms. Specifically in North Carolina, if you have a domestic violence protective order entered against you, you cannot purchase or possess firearms. Again, another protective measure. So what happens if there's a protective order that's entered and the abuser then violates that order? Another two paths can happen. The first is that I, as the plaintiff, can go back and file what's called a motion to show cause. That's asking the court to hold the abuser in contempt of court for going against what a judge has said in the order. The more effective and efficient way to violate somebody on a protective order is to call law enforcement. The North Carolina General Assembly has recognized the danger of domestic violence, and there's very few places where in the criminal statutes they say shall arrest. But if probable cause is found to have violated a domestic violence protective order, law enforcement shall arrest. So if I call and say he's driving outside of my house and law enforcement finds that to be probable cause, he's going to get arrested. Now at that point, he will be afforded an attorney because that becomes a criminal matter at that point. There is also what's called a civil no contact order. It was designed to protect victims of sexual assault who were not in a personal relationship, were not in a dating relationship. We also sometimes are able to protect same-sex dating partners who don't live together with a civil no contact order. A civil no contact order is a little less effective than a domestic violence protective order. And if you're in a situation where you're considering a civil no contact order, I would highly consider talking through that possibility with an attorney to make sure it makes the most sense. But it can also order a defendant not to abuse, assault, harass a victim, order no contact. The major difference between a domestic violence protective order and a civil no contact order is how it's enforced. Civil no contact orders are only enforceable by contempt of court. So a judge may hold somebody in contempt of court and require them to pay a fine, that sort of thing. But if I call law enforcement and say he's violating a civil no contact order, they don't have that same arrest power that they would have. So entering through the other door, yeah, absolutely.
Just take you back to the beginning of this process. About how long would it take somebody to have that initial hearing before a judge?
Great question. So in Buncombe County, the judges hear domestic violence ex parte orders at 9 a.m. or at 2 p.m. So in the morning before the court session starts or in the afternoon when it comes back from lunch. It's about 15 pages of forms that you have to fill out and have completed before you're ready to go in front of the judge. And then the hearing itself usually takes about 10 minutes.
But once you have those forms, you'll be seen that day?
Yes, yep. For an emergency, I mean, that, you know, I am in significant danger.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does your, whether or not you are considered illegal or undocumented citizen, does that play into whether or not you can get a 50B?
Great question, Jody. It does not. Anyone who is a resident of Buncombe County can access the civil legal protections. And very often we have clients who are undocumented or who their partner is undocumented who don't feel comfortable accessing the criminal remedies that we'll talk about and are able to get court protections, civil legal protections through the domestic violence protective order process and not have those criminal implications of that. Yeah.
You said that it prevents you from purchasing firearms. What about if you already own firearms?
So if you own firearms, you can be ordered to surrender those firearms as well. So purchasing and possessing.
But
That's not
I'm sorry.
So you have to have a fact that's related to the guns for the orders?
Well, that's a great question, Your Honor. And if I was in your court, I would argue that you do not. However, many judges find that you do have to have a fact. I think that we have some pretty clear federal legislation that says that if you are subject to a domestic violence protective order, you cannot possess or purchase. However, North Carolina law requires that finding of fact. A finding of fact is that there was, thank you. A finding of fact is that I can prove to the judge that a relevant thing happened regarding firearms, the threatened use of a firearm, that sort of thing within the actual case. Yeah.
So in this case, the partner, whoever, would be required to surrender all their firearms in that case?
They would be required. Now, there's not a lot of check and balance on that process. So if I'm subject to a protective order, I can say I've turned in all my guns. The victim does not have an attorney that specifically represents their rights. The district attorney is prosecuting the case of the crime, but the victim is part of that process, but they're not representing the victim. Defendants have a right to an attorney in criminal actions. If there's been a criminal action filed against you as a defendant, you can either hire an attorney or you will be appointed one if you cannot afford one. There's two ways to sort of initiate a criminal action. The first is that contact with law enforcement. When law enforcement responds to the scene, when we call 911, and there's been an assault on a female, law enforcement can initiate that criminal action, and that case moves forward. The other way is, as Judge Dotson-Smith talked about, is that in North Carolina, we're one of 4 states in the nation where an individual can go to the magistrate and initiate criminal actions. Starting December 1st, the General Assembly made that a little bit more difficult and shifted that a little bit so that in order for a criminal action to be started in that process, law enforcement may be called to investigate. That's way more detailed than y'all need to know about, but it's a shift that's occurred. As a victim of crime in North Carolina, once that criminal action has been initiated, the North Carolina General Assembly has identified what we refer to as the Crime Victims' Rights Act. It's North Carolina General Statute 15A, which follows immediately after 14, which is our crimes, the list of all of the crimes in North Carolina. So victims of crime have a legal right to be informed of and be present during the court proceedings. They have to be heard at the sentencing. They have to be given information about the crime, about how the justice system works and what resources are available. They have the right to receive notification of escape or release. And they have a right to present their views when probation or parole hearings are happening. They have a right to confer with the prosecution. So So the district attorney's office must speak with a victim in deciding their case. Doesn't mean, again, that the district attorney's office represents the victim, but they have the right to be conferred. And then they have the right to receive information about the conviction for final disposition. Oh my goodness, all right, 2 minutes, here we go. So, the Family Justice Center. What you really came to hear me talk about. When we as a community looked at the services that were available for victims of domestic and sexual violence, we identified that in the first 3 days after experiencing trauma, we asked a victim of domestic and sexual violence to go to 8 different places in our community. She had to fill out 61 pages of forms, talk to 21 people, wait 8 times, and she got handed 30 referrals. Right? Absolutely. Now, we were a community with really strong services who were doing good work for survivors, but when you hear those numbers and you think about somebody who has experienced trauma and living in fear, we knew that we had to do better. And so we identified a national best practice model called a Family Justice Center, where instead of asking a victim of domestic or sexual violence to get in her car and go to those 8 different places, we have worked together with a multidisciplinary team to bring all of those services under one roof. And now, in Buncombe County, a victim of domestic or sexual violence parks her car 1 time. She walks through the door and she's greeted by what we call an intake specialist who can help her identify what different resources she wants to get connected to. Does she want to talk to law enforcement? Does she want to talk to Pisgah Legal Services? Does she want to talk with HelpMate? And all of those professionals are under one roof. Sometimes we use the analogy of a mall where it's not like a Walmart where that one organization is doing all the things. Each of those organizations retains their expertise and provides individualized services, but we do it in a way that is more coordinated and supportive for victims. At the Family Justice Center, victims can access counseling and safety planning, court advocacy from HelpMate and Our Voice. They can access legal services. Both Pisgah Legal Services and the district attorney are located at the Family Justice Center. I'm going to go 1 minute over. One of the things that we're really proud of and excited to be able to offer our community is that we have on-site forensic medical exam services. Mission Health actually has an outpatient clinic at the Family Justice Center where people who have been impacted by sexual violence can get a forensic medical exam done. So they no longer have to go to the emergency department and go through that process. They are there where there's immediate access to advocates, and if they choose, there's also access to law enforcement in the initiation of those charges. So, because this is Advocacy 101, how you can get involved to support this work. And the first thing that I would say is to speak up, to talk with your community about how we respond to domestic and sexual violence. We're a community who is building up standards, not bystanders, and we are saying enough that we do not tolerate domestic and sexual violence. I'd really encourage you to find out more about our nonprofit partners, HelpMate, Our Voice, and Pisgah Legal Services. They are doing great work and they could use support of time, talent, and treasure. Also, the opportunity to advocate for policies that genuinely protect victims of violence. And we have a really powerful Survivors Advisory Council at the Family Justice Center that's made up of a group of survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And if that's impacted your life and you're interested in continuing to change the way our community responds to domestic and sexual violence, I would love to talk with you about that opportunity. All right.